Good morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us. And a big thank you to all of you for your ongoing support through your contributions, by becoming members, and by renewing your memberships. The need for our informed, nonpartisan discussions is more critical than ever. We are providing these live streams free as a public service, which is why we can't do this without you. Please visit our website at lawac.org to see how you can support our mission so that we can continue to bring you quality programming like today. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, with politics professor Dan Schnur. Dan's focus today will be on after the protests, talking about race and criminal justice in America. Will June protesters turn into November voters? To mask or not to mask, our growing cultural divide. For those of you who are with us online, we will be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and we'll try our very best to get to as many questions as possible. Dan, so happy to have you back. I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Well, Kim, thank you so much for letting me join you again. And thanks to all of you for joining us again today. I know that many of you were with us last week when we had the opportunity to talk to Congressman Adam Schiff. And just as a reminder, we are in the process of scheduling a prominent Republican as well, hopefully either Representative Kevin McCarthy or Senator Marco Rubio, to join us in the future. So even if every single one of our programs doesn't establish a broad ideological base, it's something that we do try to do over time. And to me, that's always been one of the really great things about LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. And today, as always, we'll do our best to live up to that even-handed approach. So as Kim mentioned, we're going to talk about three topics today. First, we're going to talk about race and criminal justice in America, then about voter turnout, particularly among young people and minority voters. And then third, about our growing cultural divide in this country, which we're calling, for the sake of this discussion, to mask or not to mask. So let's start by talking about race and criminal justice in this very, very challenging time period that we're currently dealing with. And I think it's worth starting by acknowledging that these two topics, race relations and criminal justice, depending on how they're addressed, have the potential to drive the political debate in very different directions. And what else I'll say briefly, and then we can get to some polling data that I think you'll find interesting, is to put this as simply as possible. The race relations discussion, as we'll see in just a minute, has the potential political impact of being of great benefit to Joe Biden's presidential campaign. Whereas the discussion about criminal justice is something that perhaps President Trump and his advisors see as a potential advantage to them. So let's talk about some poll numbers first, and then we'll reframe this in a political context in just a minute or two. So the Monmouth University poll, which we've cited in the past, one of the more respected polls in the country, showed for the first time about a week ago that the majority of Americans believe the police are more likely to use excessive force against African Americans than against whites. A majority of Americans, 57%, and a plurality of whites, a near majority of 49%, believe that. And that's a market shift, and let's talk about how marked it is. Because if you go back 6 years, after the tragedy of Eric Garner being killed by New York City police in that summer, the same Monmouth poll, only 33% showed, that same poll showed that only 33% of Americans believe that the African American community is more likely to be abused by police. Among whites, that number was just 26%. So in 6 years, those numbers have almost doubled. And I think to a large degree, that's the fuel that we're seeing driving this discussion forward. One other poll I'm going to cite for you on this topic, according to the Yahoo News YouGov poll, which also came out last week, about 2/3 of African Americans say Black and whites do not receive equal treatment from the police. And once again, when they polled back in 2014, that number was at 38%. So once again, a very large increase, almost double in terms of attitudes on the inequality of police treatment among those of different races and ethnicities. But, and we'll come back to this more in a minute, but I'm going to flag it right now, that same YouGov poll showed that when asked about cutting funding for police departments, an overwhelming majority opposed that suggestion. Republicans, not surprisingly, opposed the idea of cutting funding for police by a margin of 75 to 15. But Democrats opposed it by a margin of 62% to 16%, a huge 46-point gap. And we'll talk more in just a minute about how that might affect the political landscape going forward. One last set of survey results, actually, that I want to cite, particularly on the organization Black Lives Matter. There's a really remarkable organization called Civics, CIVIQS, that does polling on a daily basis throughout the year to track even the most minute and most rapid changes in public opinion on a range of subjects. So let's examine what Civics polling showed when voters were asked specifically about their support or opposition or lack of support for the organization Black Lives Matter. Currently, as of a few days ago, the margin of support for Black Lives Matter among all Americans was a 28-point margin. 53% support Black Lives Matter in a poll of all Americans, whereas 25% oppose the organization. Go back just a few weeks to May 24th, 1 week before the George Floyd murder, and the margin, which is now 28 points, was only 17 points, showing 45 to 28% support for Black Lives Matter. Go back to January 1st of this year, and the support level is 10 points, 42 to 32. So in the course of less than 6 months, the margin of support for Black Lives Matter has almost tripled. And just for a little bit of historical perspective, if we go back to January of 2018, about 2.5 years ago, more Americans opposed the organization Black Lives Matter than supported them. So very, very rapid change. And what we want to do with the help of the amazing Claire Krelitz is we're going to put up our first poll question to see how you feel about that question. How would you describe your feelings about the Black Lives Matter movement? Select one of the following. I became a supporter after the events of the last few weeks. 2, I became a supporter earlier this year. 3, I was a supporter before 2020, before this year. And 4, finally, I am not a supporter. And so what we'll see in just a minute is if your responses track with those of the overall electorate. So Claire, when you have the results ready, let's put them up on screen and see how we do. So I became a supporter after the event of the last few weeks. A full quarter, roughly, of our respondents have reviewed and adjusted their opinions of Black Lives Matter, just as many Americans have in the last few weeks. A few did earlier this year. 61% were a supporter before 2020, markedly above the national numbers. And I am not a supporter, 11%, a little bit less than half of the overall national results. So very, very interesting. So let's go on to the second part of this discussion. We've talked about race relations. Now let's talk about criminal justice. And already, as most of you know, earlier this week, Democratic congressional leaders began moving forward with a variety of police reform measures. Now, some of these are pretty low-hanging fruit. And in this climate, unlike what we would have seen even a month ago, I suspect there are some measures that are being proposed that are going to pass without any problem. Strengthened use of force standards. No one's going to be arguing in favor of chokeholds in this climate. Enhanced anti-bias and de-escalation training procedures should be a fairly easy one to accomplish. And then also the establishment of a national police registry that would prevent so-called rogue cops, gypsy cops, from moving from one department to another after a just cause dismissal. So those probably move forward, probably even with bipartisan support. But there's other parts of the Democrats' package that are going to be more divisive. For example, mandatory body cameras. In the past, a lot of civil rights advocates have raised issues relating to privacy and civil liberties of having those cameras on all the time. No knock warrants. Some opponents argue that a prohibition of no knock warrants might make it easier for drug dealers to dispose of their products while police are waiting outside a door. And especially tricky is the discussion of what's called qualified legal immunity, which Congressman Schiff and I discussed last week. The legal protections that police officers have been given to protect them from lawsuits. Now, every one of these measures has the potential to cause real unease among key voter groups that have swung away from Trump toward Biden over the last few months. Groups like older voters, senior citizens, suburban voters, particularly suburban women, who moved away from Trump because of his handling over COVID-19. These are generally voters who are more sensitive to law enforcement and public safety issues. And it's clear that Trump and his team see an opportunity here for him. The most heated discussion of all is the debate over defunding, quote unquote, police departments, which is not part of the Democratic congressional package, but it's enjoying growing support from many party activists and a growing number of elected officials around the country. Now, most advocates of defunding make it clear that their goal is not to shut down police departments, but rather to shift, to redirect some of that funding from the police to social service organizations to take on oversight issues like homelessness, drug abuse, and other societal problems that have fallen in the laps of the police because no one else has wanted to take them on. But there is a sizable number of advocates demanding even more dramatic changes that would abolish local police departments altogether, both here in Los Angeles and around the country. Now, Joe Biden himself has already rejected these defunding proposals, as have the Democratic congressional leaders for the most part. But others are less restrained. The Minneapolis City Council has voted to move in this direction. Representative Ilhan Omar and others in the Democratic Congressional Caucus have said that police departments should be disbanded. And so Trump, not surprisingly, is already working very hard to link Biden to the more extreme voices in the Democratic Party. And the president is going to continue to attempt to leverage the argument over what precisely defunding means to convince those older voters and suburban voters that Democrats are not sufficiently committed to public safety. Biden obviously will continue to distance himself from those more extreme proposals. But one of Biden's greatest challenges, as you all know, and we've talked about a lot in previous weeks, one of Biden's greatest challenges has been to motivate his party's ideological base, particularly young people and minority voters, without ceding the political center to Trump. Now, that's a tricky challenge for Biden under any circumstances, but the ongoing debate over police reform makes it an even more difficult challenge. So to sum up, I'll put it this way. Black Lives Matter is a helpful hashtag for Joe Biden. Defund the police could be a very valuable slogan and perhaps a very valuable weapon for Donald Trump. So let's move on. Will June protesters turn into November voters? As I mentioned a moment ago, we had a lot of young people and a lot of representatives from minority communities who've turned out for the protests that we've seen in Los Angeles and across the country over the last few weeks. So now, but even while Joe Biden's lead grows in public opinion polls, to a large degree because of the heightened visibility of the debate over race relations, most polls still show that the Democratic base is less enthusiastic about Biden than the Republican base is about Trump. And it's worth noting that these same individuals who are disproportionately represented at the protests are those individuals who Biden needs most strongly if he's going to be successful in the fall. Now, if Biden continues to maintain a double-digit lead in the polls, it's not going to matter all that much. But if this race gets closer, turnout from the base of the Democratic Party becomes more and more important. And while Biden has begun to address the issues, in my opinion, relating to George Floyd's death more forcefully, he's never going to be the electrifying presence on these types of issues that many of the protesters want. It's worth looking back to the Democratic primary and to think about how different that primary might have gone had Mr. Floyd's tragic death occurred 1 year earlier in the spring of 2019 rather than the spring of 2020. You may remember that Senator Cory Booker So his campaign message was one of love and racial conciliation, but it never caught on with primary voters. Other younger candidates who were more aggressive on these issues, Kamala Harris, Andrew Yang, Julian Castro, may have made a greater impact. Maybe Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren could have broken through. But the same young people who are protesting now didn't vote in the primary. The question is whether they'll vote in the fall. And so with that, let's ask your opinion on that question. And so Claire, if we can put up the second question of our three. In your opinion, how will the events of the last few weeks affect voting turnout among young people in minority communities? 1, turnout will increase greatly. 2, turnout will increase slightly. And again, this is a reminder, turnout among young people in minority communities. Do you think turnout will increase greatly? Do you think turnout in these communities will increase slightly? Do you think turnout among young people in minority communities will stay roughly the same? Or do you think turnout in these key voter groups will go down? And so once again, we'll be eager to see your answers. And just to be fair, well, just to be unfair, I think I've told you in the past, I don't like to make predictions, but we're asking you to, and I realize that is a little bit unfair. So let's see, Claire. Let's see what everybody thinks. They're courageous enough to make predictions when I don't. What do they say? Wow, look at these numbers. 44% think that turnout among young people in minority communities will increase greatly. An additional 47% say turnout will increase slightly. That's more than 90% of you who believe that young people and minority voters will turn out in much greater numbers than in years past. 9% say the turnout will stay the same among these groups, and 1% say the turnout will go down. So finally, and we're going to go to your questions in just a minute, but just briefly, I want to cover one more question, one more topic. To mask or not to mask, a growing cultural divide. And I'm going to cite one more set of poll numbers that I think you'll find very, very interesting. Now, I want to be clear before I cite these numbers from Wall Street Journal poll. This poll was taken just as the protests were beginning. So we have not yet seen how the behavior and the conduct of the protesters might affect them. But Wall Street Journal's poll asked people if they supported Biden or Trump, as many polls do, but also ran those numbers against a question about whether the respondents wore masks or not. So for those who always wear a mask, as recommended by the federal government, they said they supported Biden over Trump by 30 points, by a margin of 66 to 26%. So for those who always wear a mask, 66 Biden, 26 Trump. But for those who never or rarely wear masks, they supported Trump, which shouldn't surprise you. But the margin was even larger. 83% of Americans who rarely or never wear masks supported Donald Trump. Only 7% of those who never or rarely wear masks backed Joe Biden. And that reflects the type of very broad, not just political, but cultural divide that we've talked about in past on these webinars and we'll talk about again in the future, the urban-rural divisions, other types of cultural splits, and how unfortunate it is that at this critical point in our nation's history, in our nation's health, that even masks have become somewhat of a weapon in those culture wars. Now, of course, over the last couple of weeks, large numbers of protesters did not wear masks or adhere to social distancing requirements either. And so I'm going to ask you your opinion, and Claire, if we can put up the third question here, and find out from you what you think is an appropriate reason not to wear a mask during this time of COVID-19, if there is any. So which of the following groups concern you most when they choose not to wear masks or abide by social distancing? Number one, those who protested George Floyd's death. Does the fact that many protesters were not wearing masks, does that concern you most? Second, those who attend religious services. For those who wanted to go to religious services in person in large groups, is that something that concerned you? Second, it says all, but probably should say both. Are you equally concerned about both groups? Or finally, neither. Are you not concerned? Do you find both of those reasons to be valid ones? And these are really difficult questions. Any number of medical specialists have argued that protesting against racism is a legitimate reason to forego social distancing precautions. Is protesting a good reason? Is expressing religious faith a good reason? What about earning a paycheck, providing for your children's future, or whether your children should be attending school? Let's see what all of you think, at least on those first two questions. Which of the following groups concern you most when they choose not to wear masks or abide by social distancing? 5% each said those who protested Mr. Floyd's death and those who attended religious services. 86% of our respondents said that they were equally concerned by those who chose not to wear masks in either circumstances, and only 4% say neither. So it's pretty clear that this group, at least, believes that, I'm extrapolating here, that as important as protests against racial and social injustice can be, as important as expressions of religious belief can be, ultimately our health, individually as families and communities, is the most important. And our group today says that in very, very large numbers. So with that, we've covered 3 topics. And what I'd like to do now, if Jessica is ready, is let's change this monologue into a conversation. And Jessica, my question for you is, how are we doing on questions from our attendees today?
Thank you. Sorry, let me turn my light on so I'm not so in the dark. Hi. We're doing good. We're getting a ton of questions. Just a quick thing. I know people were saying that some of them couldn't reply to the poll. I apologize. We usually get about 60% of people participating on those polls before we close them, but we only leave them open for about 20 to 30 seconds. So you do have to vote quickly. So for those of you who weren't able to submit your reply, I apologize, but we just want to make sure that the conversation moves along and we hear from Dan as much as possible.
And in the future, I'll do a better job of reminding everyone, Jessica, that we do want to hear from them quickly, as quickly as possible, so that we can show the results in real time.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. And so, like I said, I apologize to those who didn't get to submit their answer. Our first question is the enthusiasm of the Democratic base not in favor of Biden, but enthusiasm to vote against Trump?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a smart one. And this, to a large degree, I believe, is what Biden and his team are relying on as they work to fashion a winning strategy for November. I think they understand that Biden, for any number of reasons, is not a particularly motivating factor for many in the base of the Democratic Party. Young people, minority voters, large numbers of Democrats who supported Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. And so they are counting on Donald Trump being able to motivate the base of the Democratic Party in a way that Biden may not be able to. One other point on that, Jessica, before we go on, is a lot of Democratic strategists and a lot of Republican strategists as well believe that the heightened visibility of the debate over race relations makes the dynamic that our questioner asked about even stronger in Biden's favor. In other words, there's some ambivalence among Democratic Party regulars about Vice President Biden's record on race relations, but there's no ambivalence at all when it comes to Donald Trump. And just yesterday, LeBron James, of all people, announced a nationwide voter mobilization effort to get people to turn out, not specifically for or against one candidate, but more specifically in reaction to what he and many others see as racial injustices that have long since not been addressed. And so Biden will continue to do everything he can to prove his credentials on this front. But ultimately, Trump may, as always, be the motivator in chief on both sides of the aisle.
Thank you. Isn't it true that the November election will turn on how independents who voted for Trump last time vote in 2020? Isn't he likely to get fewer independents this time around?
Well, and this is the flip side of the first question, and it's an equally smart one, is in order to win an election under most circumstances, and Trump is an outlier, at least in 2016 was an outlier in this regard. When a political strategist, when a candidate wants to win an election, they fashion a strategy that needs to accomplish 2 things simultaneously. Number one, you need to motivate your base to make sure they turn out in large numbers. But number two, you need to persuade voters at or near the center of the political discussion. So whether they're registered independents, or as we're called here in California, no party preference voters, or whether they're relative centrists who can switch back and forth between parties under appropriate circumstances, that's the second half of the Biden challenge. And as I mentioned when we were talking about race relations and criminal justice, this is where that debate gets a little bit tricky for Biden, both as it relates to the Democratic base and as it relates to swing voters. Biden is seen as far superior in the eyes of most voters on questions of who can unify the nation and who can more satisfactorily address questions of race relations. But on criminal justice, particularly given the ongoing visibility of a debate over quote unquote defunding, that's the type of thing that can move some centrist voters, particularly older voters, particularly suburban voters, from the Democratic to the Republican column. For those of our participants with longer memories, you'll remember that in the 1980s and 1990s, Republican candidates at all levels of politics were very effective in using issues relating to public safety and law enforcement in order to win over the swing voters. That's been a less successful approach recently, but even given the growing appetite for police reform in this country, I think Biden and his team are very wary of the potential for Democratic overreach, which could cost them some of the swing voters and independents that they've won over since the onset of the pandemic a few months ago.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions about Vice President Biden's VP pick. One question is, will his decision be more important than traditional VP picks are to voter turnout / decisions? Did he complicate things by saying that it has to be a woman? And does it also need to be a woman of color?
Well, there's no question that Biden's running mate is getting much more attention and arguably carries more substantive import than even that critically important decision would in most other cases. One of that, of course, is Joe Biden's age. He is not he's not stated out loud that he would only serve one term as president. I think he recognizes the downside of being pegged as a lame duck on his first day in office. But Biden has hinted that he might only serve one term. And even if he were to run for a second term, he's increasingly begun to refer to himself as a bridge to a new generation of Democratic leaders. And so his running mate, particularly if he's elected president, becomes the odds-on Democratic standard bearer in, as premature as it is used the phrase right now, in a post-Biden era. Biden, of course, pledged very early on to select a female candidate, which eliminates a number of very qualified candidates. But as Biden himself has correctly pointed out, there's no shortage whatsoever of very, very qualified female political leaders who he could select. But in recent weeks, particularly as this debate over race relations has assumed so much more public attention, it's beginning to appear more and more likely that not only will he pick a woman, but speculation is that he would likely pick a female, also a female of color. Kamala Harris, our own senator from here in California, is considered by most observers to be the odds-on favorite, although no one knows for sure, of course, except for Joe and Jill Biden. But in addition to Kamala Harris, two names that didn't get a lot of attention earlier in the year have become much more plausible picks. One is Representative Val Demings of Florida, and she's the former police chief of her city, which brings an interesting mix of law enforcement credentials and more progressive background on any number of other issues. And then the other is Keisha, I think we talked about this last week. Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, has received great praise from the way she has led her city through the challenges of the last few weeks and has begun to get much more visibility, not only in the news media, but on a national level more broadly. So Harris still logically looks like the favorite, but both Representative Demings and Mayor Bottoms really do look like the kind of person who Biden might turn to, not only to help him motivate the Democratic base, female and minority and younger voters all, but also to help him frame a discussion on race relations that takes an issue that already works in his favor and makes it even a stronger advantage for him.
Thank you. You speak of the cultural divide. Separately, you speak of the political divide. It sounds as if there is a near one-to-one correlation between the two. Are they that highly correlated? Otherwise, how should we best think about their relationship?
Well, it's a fascinating question, because when we talk about how polarized America has become, we often talk about that both politically and culturally. Now, Rebecca Friedman, the very smart state legislator who represents northwestern LA County, likes to say that culture eats politics for breakfast. Steve Bannon, the former advisor to the president, he says it a slightly different way. He said politics lies downstream from politics. But what they're both saying from two very different ideological vantage points is that politics doesn't exist in a vacuum. Most people make their political decisions in the context of broader cultural and societal factors. And as our country becomes more and more divided from an urban-rural standpoint, from a religious and secular standpoint, and as we've seen in the last few weeks from a racial and ethnic standpoint, those divisions can't help but to affect the body politic. When I referred to the cultural divide in the title of that third question we raised about masks, I was reflecting this very large divide in terms of one particularly important symbol, whether an individual decides to wear a mask or not. And what we see is that in rural America, where until recently the caseload has been much less, a lot fewer people wear masks in rural areas and in small towns than in urban or suburban parts of the country. We see equally large gaps when it comes to other questions, whether it's about race relations, whether it's about religious attitudes. And so again, this is the type of conversation that deserves a lot more time than we can give it at this moment. But I think what I can best do to address the questioner's concept, which I really do like, is cultural divides inevitably lead to political divides. When someone signs us up as a Republican or Democrat, they're not just choosing shirts or skins. They're signing up because of what one party's candidates have to say about the issues that affect their lives. And because we live in different cultural and societal situations around this country, it shouldn't be surprising that voters from one side of this culture gap lean in one way politically, while those on the other side culturally lean in the opposite direction politically as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I was reflecting on that recently. I tend to be maybe a little bit too online for where I get my news, but I was thinking about how cultural changes used to maybe take years or decades. And now with social media being so pervasive and our ability to share these images and messages globally, that you can change a culture in 2 weeks, as we've seen just obviously in the last month. So anyway, our next question: why don't younger people believe it makes a difference whether Biden or Trump wins? What convinces young people that less than ideal candidates should be supported because they lead to different outcomes?
Look, as a former young person, albeit many, many years ago, I understand and sympathize with the frustrations that many young people feel in this country. And this is not a criticism of them, because it's something that we all share. It's just a little bit more noticeable in the young. Politics is about differentiating between the perfect and the good. And as we get older, not just in politics, not just in culture, but in every part of our life, more and more of us realize that achieving perfection is an admirable but difficult goal in any part of our lives. And so ultimately we end up choosing a better option rather than a perfect one. And particularly when it comes to politics, older voters, whether Generation X or baby boomers or the greatest generation, tend to become more reflective and maybe more philosophical about their political choices. Young people, on the other hand, are idealistic. They haven't been in the world as long as we have, and they might not have suffered the same kind of setbacks that many people of older generations have, that their parents or grandparents have faced. And I think that idealism is one of the most important qualities, not just of the young person, but in our country altogether. The way we make progress is by people, young or otherwise, holding that idealism close to their heart. But where that creates a challenge politically is when it comes time to vote on election day, particularly if your favorite candidate didn't win the primary. It's really easy to say, you know what, I don't really care about either one of them all that much. I'll just stay home. In 2016, and Jessica, you and I have talked about this before, after the 2016 election, when voting among the youngest generation dropped off precipitously from where it had been during Barack Obama's 2 elections, after that election, a lot of my former students said to me, you know what, I've learned my lesson. Now I understand. And it's easy to criticize them, but I think it's also worth remembering where they were in 2016. Go back 4 years when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were on the ballot. And what I would point out to you is that there was no American under the age of 30 in that election who had ever voted in an election that had been won by a Republican. If you were under the age of 30 in 2016, you hadn't been old enough to vote when George W. Bush was elected. So it's relatively easy to think, well, sure, there are 2 parties technically, and sure, theoretically, a Republican can win. But that's back in my parents' era. That doesn't happen anymore. And so they stayed home. Now, here we are 4 years later, and of course, the same idealism is at war with the idea of settling for 2 less than perfect choices. Joe Biden himself, ironically, has said over the years, one of his favorite sayings, and he variously attributes it to his mother, his grandfather, and other relatives. He likes to say, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. And if there is a way for Biden surrogates who have more credibility with young people than the candidate himself to carry that message to them between now and November, he will be successful. If they're not able to pull that off, then he may not be.
Thank you. My friend from North Carolina had a similar saying, but hers was not as eloquent. It was, you have to choose from the cream of the crop. So that was not quite as nice as what Vice President Biden said, but she said it in a nice Southern accent, so it sounded much better.
One quick thing before we move on, Jessica, and we talked about this in the first 15 minutes of the program. This is why the discussion over race relations is so important, not just for the obvious real world reasons, but politically as well. Is it highlights an issue on which many young people may not find Joe Biden's positions to be satisfying, but find them to be more visibly preferable than other issues where the differences are murkier. And so simply put, the more Joe Biden can talk about race relations in this campaign, the better off he is in terms of turning out young people and minority voters and others at the base of the Democratic Party.
Thank you. Isn't defunding police budgets primarily a local issue? The White House may voice an opinion on this topic, but only local jurisdictions have the power to change local law enforcement budgets. Is this not true?
It's mostly true. It is mostly true that ultimately local level decision makers, mayors and city councils, make funding decisions for police departments. But that said, both state governments around the country and federal governments can also either offer or withhold tremendous amounts of additional funds. And this is money that local governments have become very dependent on over the years and are going to be even more dependent on now, given the hits that their budgets have taken over the coronavirus pandemic. So even though ultimately these decisions are made locally, there is a role for state and federal government. And so I suspect that's one reason why not just Biden, but Speaker Pelosi as well, didn't simply say, oh, that's up to the locals, but made it clear that it was something that they didn't support in order to make it more difficult for Trump to turn into an issue on the campaign trail. That said, just as when very conservative Republicans raise an issue, Democrats will try to tie that to more mainstream Republican candidates. Donald Trump and his allies have lost no time trying to tie Biden and other Democratic leaders to those voices in the Democratic Party who want not just to shift funding, but to dramatically reduce funding to police departments, and in some cases even abolish them. It's a dangerous issue for Biden, and it'll be very, very instructive to see how he and Trump navigate that particular discussion just in the next several days and weeks going forward.
Thank you. How do you see the ongoing protests affecting Rust Belt swing states?
How do the protests affect Rust Belt swing states? And I think the questioner is particularly asking about those small town and rural voters that we were talking about earlier. But I think it's also a relevant question for urban areas, because a lot of those Rust Belt states have very large urban areas with very significant minority populations. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania are home to Detroit, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So it's really a twofold question that I think the audience members is raising. In both cases, I think it's entirely dependent on whether or not the protests remain peaceful. In the first several days of protesting, we saw outbreaks of violence around the country. And had those continued at that level, as was the case way back in 1968, that is an issue that could have redounded to the benefit of Republican candidates espousing a law and order message. But after those first days of conflagration, the protests, not completely, there have been examples of violence every night since, but for the most part, the protests have been peaceful. And if they continue to stay peaceful, then it's something that becomes certainly less damaging to Democrats and perhaps even advantageous as it leads to the increases in voter turnout that we were talking about earlier. So simply put, rural and small town voters are going to react strongly against what they see as violence on the streets. But when the protests are peaceful, that calms their concerns and motivates the Democratic base to turn out. So it's a question of what kind of protest takes place almost entirely.
Thank you. On previous calls, you recommended Biden choose a Latina woman. I have seen no mention of either of the two politicians you suggested, and you did not mention them today. Have recent events pushed Biden towards choosing a Black candidate, and will that help him or hurt him relative to a Latina?
I suspect it has shifted Biden's thinking, once again with the disclaimer that we don't know. And me, like most self-proclaimed pundits, are relying on observers and analysts and leaks, as opposed to inside knowledge of what Joe Biden is actually thinking. But a couple things as it relates to the Latinas we've spoken about in the past. First, Senator Castro of Nevada announced, actually just in the roughly a week before George Floyd's tragic murder, Senator Castro announced that she did not want to be considered to be Biden's running mate. She said she was very flattered, but felt that her best role was in the Senate. And so the other most prominent Latina who's commonly been mentioned is Governor Lujan Grisham of New Mexico. She has received less attention over the last few weeks because even while I think we can all agree every ethnic and racial minority suffers from abject discrimination, the particular focus on the African American community over the last few weeks greatly increases the likelihood that his running mate is an African American woman, as opposed to a woman of color from another ethnicity. That said, Governor Lujan Grisham, Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois, who's of Asian heritage, are likely still under consideration. But in this current political climate, the likelihood of an African American running mate becomes much, much greater.
Thank you. Are you aware of any electoral cycle in which candidates for national, state, and local office from the same party abandoned the presidential nominee of their party?
Boy, in modern history, I'm not aware of a wholesale defection like that, where large numbers of local and state candidates either endorsed against their party's nominee or simply stayed out of the race. We see examples of it, just like some of the never Trumpers, such as George W. and Jeb Bush in 2016, refused to support Donald Trump. In the past, we've often seen more conservative Democrats, particularly from southern states, who've stayed very, very low key in their presidential elections, occasionally crossing over to the other side. Zell Miller, the former Democratic governor of Georgia, endorsed George W. Bush for president in either 2000 or 2004, if I'm not mistaken. But it tends to be very, very isolated instances, if only because an elected official representing a party represents potential harm in the future by straying from that party, from the nominee of a party whose members overwhelmingly support that candidate. What generally tends to happen, instead of visible abandonment in opposition, is a lot of them just keep their heads down. And when a campaign looks like it's doing poorly, Democrat or Republican, in the fall of a general election year, the candidate on the losing side generally sees a lot of his or her closest friends stay friends, but they become much quieter friends.
Thank you. Can you comment on what's been happening with the elections in Georgia and Wisconsin, particularly around how long the lines have been for people to vote?
So, as we saw in Georgia this week, as we'd seen in the state of Wisconsin a couple of months ago, it's very clear that many states are woefully unprepared for the challenges of voting, particularly during a time of coronavirus. In Georgia, the finger pointing goes in both directions, and not being there, I'm hard pressed to say who's right or who's more right. The Republican Secretary of State in Georgia has fallen under huge criticism for not adequately preparing local officials for the new voting machines and for other changes in procedure. That said, the Republican Secretary of State points out that many local officials, primarily Democratic, in Fulton and DeKalb County in the greater Atlanta area, struggled with these changes at the same time that in other parts of the state, things were running very smoothly. So new voting machines is always a challenge. The loss of volunteers because of the pandemic is an additional challenge. The demand for social distancing creates an additional challenge. And the first instinct nature of partisan finger pointing and blame laying is yet another. So it's not my place to say, I'm just not smart enough to say, or not as close to the ground to know whether it's a Republican statewide elected official or local Democrats who dropped the ball there in Georgia this week. I suspect it was both, but I wouldn't be able to tell you who was more at fault. In the long run, ultimately, regardless of who's more at fault, it is a tremendous challenge for November. The related issue, which I'll touch on for just a moment, and perhaps we can talk about at greater length next week or in the weeks ahead, is the prospect of elections that are not decided on election day. The increase in vote by mail, which is one of the contributing factors that caused such complications in Georgia, as we know here in California, vote by mail can often mean delayed results. Here in this state, and in a large number of others where they're experimenting with this on a broader scale for the first time, a ballot only needs to be postmarked by election day, which means, as we discussed a week or two ago, that means often it doesn't even arrive until several days after the election has taken place. One of the real concerns that we may face as a country, one of the real challenges we may face as a country this fall, is the challenge of informing the American voters in advance that we might not know on Wednesday morning who the President of the United States is. And for those of you who remember the weeks that followed the election in the year 2000 and what a difficult time period that was, well, the political and cultural gaps that we talked about earlier have only become much, much greater. And voters who are accustomed, understandably, to finding out whether their candidate won or lost on election night, helping them understand that those results are delayed is going to be a real challenge for the news media, for government, and for all of us.
Thank you. Can you speak a little bit about the messaging of defund the police we're seeing now that it's not that we want to defund the police departments, we want to redirect resources to other options, and then there's some that are specifically saying, no, we want to defund the police. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing in polling or insights that you've gained on that?
Well, the questioner frames it exactly right. Defund the police, and this represents a little bit of peril for the Democrats, has already come to mean a lot of different things. For some leaders, primarily, for example, Mayor Steinberg in Sacramento, and Mayor Liccardi in San Jose, and Mayor Faulconer in San Diego, that means shifting some existing funds that the police currently use for social services, like homelessness, like drug abuse, to organizations that focus on those challenges more specifically. Other mayors, such as our Mayor Garcetti here in Los Angeles and Mayor Breed in San Francisco, have called for reducing the amount of money being spent on the local police force, but by a fairly small margin. Other more dramatic voices, including those who pushed for what's known as the citizens budget here in Los Angeles and similar efforts around the country, have called for reducing police funding by as much as 90%. And of course, the Minneapolis City Council and local elected officials in other parts of the country are talking about the absolute abolishment of the police. And even abolishment or dismantling of the police can mean a couple different things. The LA Times had a terrific story on Wednesday, which I'd recommend to all of you if you didn't see it, talking about Camden, New Jersey's experience a few years back with abolishing the police department. Now, abolish is an even stronger word than defunding. But if you read the story, what you find out is that Camden shut down its police department and immediately started a new one. And this new police department has greater funding and has more police officers than the one that preceded it. So some of the more forceful advocates talk about dismantling in hopes that more community-based public safety solutions would emerge. Other more mainstream voices tend to find that to be a little bit more fanciful and talk about either reducing funding or shifting it. So if you're Joe Biden, you want funding to mean adjusting. If you're Donald Trump, you want it to mean abolishing. And that's an argument that they're going to have because this one very loaded term has so many different definitions in the political debate right now.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting when we do the talk next Wednesday to also hear kind of their perspective. We're going to be hosting an event with the head of the Urban League, the head of Hope, and the head of Cause to kind of see what their communities are thinking about this rhetoric, that how it might impact their communities too.
Oh, Jessica, I'm really glad you mentioned it. For those of you who have seen the emails of the other promotions that the World Affairs Council Town Hall has been doing, Michael Lawson, the head of the Los Angeles chapter of the Urban League, the largest African-American community organization in Southern California, Helen Tautas, the head of HOPE, which is an acronym for Hispanis Organized for Political Equality, and Charlie Wu, the head of Cause, as Jessica said, which stands for Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment, are going to be part of what I think will be a really exciting conversation next week, next Wednesday. And I hope you'll join that on Wednesday at 11, just like I hope you'll join this discussion next Thursday at 11. Shameless plug. Back to questions.
No, that's great. We have a lot of questions coming in on that topic. So I know we won't have time to get to all of them, but we might be able to bring those questions over to next Wednesday's talk. So if I can do a quick kind of rapid fire round to you of potential vice presidential candidates for Joe Biden, because we're getting a lot of questions on that. First would be potentially Susan Rice. What do you think of her?
Susan Rice is very impressive and has a lot of credentials that would make sense for vice president. Her biggest obstacle, although she held very prominent positions in the Obama administration, including national security advisor, she's never run for or held elective office before. And Biden and the people around him might see it as somewhat of a risk to take someone who's never run for office and put them in a position like that.
Thank you. Next one, I guess Tom Campbell suggested Condoleezza Rice as Joe Biden's vice president in an editorial. So what about Condi?
Well, I think it's a long shot. There was speculation back in 2008 that John McCain had originally wanted to put together a bipartisan ticket of him and then Democrat Joe Lieberman, and was talked out of it by his advisors because they believed that would lead to a rebellion among the base of the Republican Party. And so he listened to them and chose Sarah Palin instead, and the rest is history. I suspect, as much as I admire Secretary Rice, that Biden, already having a difficult challenge with the base of his party, would face the same kind of insurrection by putting together a bipartisan candidate as McCain would have 12 years ago.
Thank you. And this is kind of a provocative question, but would he get more votes with a Midwestern moderate who might be white or a more liberal person of color? Who helps him get more votes as of now?
Well, I'd say about 3 weeks ago, the discussion of whether Biden needed a running mate to help him motivate the base or persuade the middle was an open question. And it appeared that he might have been leaning slightly toward a more centrist selection, like Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota, or like Governor Whitmer of Minnesota. At this point, given the events that have taken place since Memorial Day, since Mr. Floyd's death, I do think, as I said earlier, that it is very, very likely that he chooses a woman of color, either African American, possibly even Latino or Asian Pacific, but very, very likely that he picks an African American woman. And while, for example, Mayor Bottoms is seen as somewhat of a moderate in her own city, generally the selection of an African American woman, particularly like Senator Harris, would be seen as a much more effective way of base motivation than as persuading undecided voters. On this very radically transformed political landscape, that probably does make sense in a way that it wouldn't have even a month ago.
Thank you. And this will be our final question. Should we be concerned about party branding instead of just candidate against candidate?
Should we be concerned about party branding instead of candidate versus candidate? Well, as I've told all of you before, I'm a no party preference voter, which by itself means that I'm not a big fan of party branding. The parties obviously play a necessary role in our political system, and particularly for less engaged voters, provides a set of cues, guidelines for voters who might not have followed individual candidates that closely. So in that sense, party branding does play a valuable role, and particularly in Congress or in any legislative body, a party that achieves a majority has a huge amount of power, regardless of the differences in ideology between the individual members of that party. That said, I think one of the smartest things that any voter can and should do is look at the candidates themselves on the merits and pay less attention to the initial after their name, whether it's D or R or NPP, and pay much more attention to the individual themselves. I think an interesting question, which perhaps, Jessica, we can talk about in a future conversation, is not the discussion of party identification versus individual makeup, but the question of policy positions versus individual character, skills, and leadership ability. A conversation that started nationally over the last year or so is a number of people who've always voted on issues on which they agree or disagree with the candidates are now saying that the personal makeup and character of a candidate, particularly for president, becomes even more important. It's a very, very interesting discussion, but I can tell by the look on your face, it's a conversation that'll have to wait for another day.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know we went right up to the end of the hour and we got through a lot of questions. I know we still had a lot more, but thank you so much, Dan. Kim, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Dan, thank you so much for keeping us so much better informed through your fact-based and insightful analysis. And I also want to do a shout out to both Jessica and Claire for their skillful work in keeping all of these great live streams and the polling and everything so well running. So thank you so much. Just a quick note on a couple upcoming programs. I know Dan and Jessica mentioned one of them, but next week on June 15th, we have the Brazilian ambassador to the U.S., His Excellency Nestor Forster, who will be discussing the ambassador's vision for the future of the U.S.-Brazil relationship and the ongoing trade negotiations between the two countries. And that, as Dan and Jessica mentioned, on June 17th, we focus on race relations during a pandemic with a stellar panel, including Michael Lawson, President and CEO of the LA Urban League, Helen Torres, President and CEO of Hope, Charlie Wu, Board Chair at Cause, and of course, moderated by our own Dan Schnur. And don't miss next Thursday, Dan's weekly series, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. You can see a full listing of all of our upcoming programs on your control panel. Just click on the word that says handout. And please visit our website at lawac.org to sign up for our programs, join as a member, or make a donation. Stay safe, stay informed, and we will all see you soon. Take care. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.